The planet Arxon Dhal had once had a name that meant the place where dawn comes twice. The twin suns would rise in sequence, the larger one painting the sky deep amber, and the smaller one following minutes later in pale rose, so that mornings on Arxon Dhal were, by the accounts of those who remembered them, the most beautiful sight in the entire Concordance of Worlds. Soldiers who had been stationed there before the war would sometimes go quiet in the middle of conversations. Someone would say something ordinary, something about rations or weapon calibrations, and a particular soldier would stop responding, their eyes going somewhere far away, and everyone around them would know. They were watching a dawn that no longer existed. The fields beneath those twin suns were glass now, fused and black from orbital bombardment so sustained that the ground itself had changed its nature. The crystal relay towers of the Arxon capital, structures so carefully engineered that they hummed in harmonic frequencies during high winds, a sound locals called the planet singing, were rubble. The harbor city of Vel Soren, which had taken 300 years to build, had been reduced to a coastline of broken stone and ash in 11 days. The war had been going on for 26 months. 26 months of the Concordance losing, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way a rope frays and frays before the final strand snaps. The Concordance was not a weak coalition. That was what made the losing so hard to absorb. It was made up of 8 distinct civilizations, the youngest of which had been spacefaring for over a millennium. Among them were the Sorathene, whose mathematical minds had engineered faster than light travel; the Drevak, whose biological sciences could grow replacement organs faster than a body could fail; the Vim, who had maintained unbroken peace within their own borders for 900 years through a diplomatic tradition so refined it had become an art form. 8 species, centuries of accumulated knowledge, and a combined military force that had, until 26 months ago, never truly been tested. The Keth tested it, and the Concordance was failing. The Keth were not a civilization in any sense the Concordance understood. They had no cities, no culture, no art, no history written by individuals, because they had no individuals. Every Keth soldier, every drone unit, every vessel commander was a node, a piece of a single vast intelligence that stretched across their entire fleet, processing every engagement simultaneously, calculating every variable in real time, adjusting every tactic the moment a pattern was identified. They did not experience loss as loss, they experienced it as data. When 10,000 drones were destroyed in a single engagement, the Keth hive logged the number, recalculated the optimal distribution of remaining forces, and moved on without a moment of grief or hesitation. Because grief required something the Keth did not possess, a self to feel it with. This was the enemy, and it was, by every measurement the Concordance's finest military minds could produce, unbeatable. On the morning that changed everything, War Master Saravan Toll stood before the Concordance High Command and spoke with the particular flatness that characterized her species, the Sorathene, in moments of extreme certainty. She was old even by Sorathene standards, tall and angular, with the pale silver complexion of her people and eyes that moved in quick calculating arcs when she was running numbers. She laid out the data without embellishment: the rate of Keth production versus Concordance attrition, the projected collapse timeline for each remaining defensive system, the probability curves for every remaining strategic option. She spoke for 40 minutes without interruption, and when she finished, the silence in the chamber was absolute.
"The Concordance cannot win this war," she said. "This is not a conclusion born of fear or failure of resolve. It is mathematics. The Keth replace their losses faster than we can cause them. Every battle we fight, even those we technically win, costs us more than it costs them. We are depleting an account that cannot be refilled. The endpoint of the current trajectory is collapse within 14 months, and no strategy within our current capabilities changes that endpoint by more than 6 weeks. Someone in the back of the chamber started talking, then others, then the room became noise. Through all of it, one figure sat still. Consul Eravan Das, the Concordance's senior diplomatic representative, a Veln, whose species was long-limbed and fine-featured, built for patience the way some species were built for speed. He had been a diplomat for 40 years. He had sat in rooms far louder than this one and waited for the noise to locate its bottom, because noise always did. He was tired in a way that had moved past his body and into something deeper, something that sleep could not reach. But he was not, even now, ready to let go of the thread. When the room quieted, he spoke one sentence. "There is a species we have not asked." The War Master turned her calculating eyes toward him. "You are speaking of the Terrans." "Yes." A sound moved through the chamber. Not laughter, exactly. Something closer to what you make when a suggestion is so far outside serious consideration that you cannot immediately decide how to respond. "Consul," said Fleet Admiral Vrex of the Dravak, a broad, dark-scaled individual who had been fighting wars since before Das had been born. "The Terrans have been in space for fewer than 2 centuries. Their fastest ship takes 3 times longer to cross a standard transit than ours. Their population is young. Their weapons technology is generations behind. They have never fought at this scale. They have never fought anything remotely like the Keth. On what basis do you believe they could offer anything that 7 advanced civilizations have failed to provide?" Das was quiet for a long moment. He had spent a great deal of time reading about Terrans. He had studied their history with the focused attention he gave to everything, and what he had found there was something he could not easily put into words that would satisfy a chamber full of military commanders looking for capabilities and specifications and numbers. "I cannot give you a specification," I admitted. "I can tell you that in their recorded history, Terran civilization has collapsed 17 times, partially or entirely. Cities burned, populations decimated, centuries of knowledge lost, and each time they rebuilt. Not because conditions became favorable. Sometimes they rebuilt when conditions became worse. I have no formula for that. I only know that I have run out of formulas, and what I am looking for now is something that doesn't fit in one." The argument in the chamber lasted for 4 hours. In the end, it was not hope that carried the vote. It was the absence of anything else. A signal was prepared and sent across deep space to a small blue-green world circling a yellow star. It was a request for help, formal and precise, and it carried underneath its formal language a desperation that Concordance diplomats had never had reason to communicate before. On Arxon Dhal, nobody on the Concordance command deck was expecting very much. That was simply the truth, and the officers present were honest enough with themselves to acknowledge it. Consul Das proposed the signal. The Council had approved it because they had run out of reasons to object. The Semicaths were what remained when every reasonable option had been exhausted, and the expectations attached to them were calibrated accordingly. When the long-range scanners above Arxon Dhal registered incoming vessels dropping from transit space at the edge of the system, the Duty Watch logged the contacts, flagged them as the anticipated Terran response force, and waited to see what a symbolic gesture from a young species looked like in practical terms. What they saw made the waiting stop immediately. It was not a small fleet. It was not a modest convoy of a few hundred vessels sent to demonstrate goodwill. What poured through the transit points was an armada, wave after wave of ships filling the sensor display until the contacts overlapped and the system had to reconfigure its scaling just to show them all. Officers who had spent careers reading tactical displays found themselves staring at screens that looked wrong, like someone had made an error in the rendering. There were simply too many. But it was not only the number of ships that made the command deck go quiet. It was what the ships looked like. Concordance vessels were works of deliberate engineering, every system balanced against every other, structural load distributed across frames designed to exact tolerances. The aesthetic of a Concordance warship was not incidental. It emerged naturally from efficiency, the same way a well-made tool develops its own kind of beauty. They were things that had been thought through completely. Terran ships had clearly been thought through, and then added to, and then modified again, and then modified in conditions that did not allow for careful modification. They were large and asymmetrical, with plating that didn't always match along its seams, weapon housings that clearly had been retrofitted onto frames not originally designed to carry them, and hull configurations that a Concordance engineer would have flagged for mandatory redesign. Their thermal signatures were enormous, running far hotter than Concordance safety protocols would have allowed any vessel to operate. They were loud in every sense that a ship could be loud. They looked like they had been built by people who needed them to work right now and would make them look correct later. And somehow, visibly, undeniably, they held together. They held together and they moved fast, and they came in without hesitation, and watching them was like watching something you had been told was impossible, doing the thing it was not supposed to be able to do. War Master Dhal stood at the observation window for a long time without speaking. Beside her, Fleet Admiral Vrex uncrossed and recrossed his arms in the unconscious way he did when confronted with something he was still processing. "They came," he said finally. It was not quite respect. It was not quite disbelief. It was the particular sound a mind makes when reality has just deviated from its model in a direction it didn't anticipate. The communication request from the lead Terran vessel, a ship called the Unyielding, came through quickly. The face that appeared on screen was a woman who looked to be in her mid-50s, with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had spent considerable time in difficult places and decided to find this unremarkable. Her right arm, from the mid-forearm down, was a cybernetic replacement, functional, unadorned, making no attempt to pass for biological. She introduced herself as Commander Lyrian Vask, commanding officer of the Terran Expeditionary Force, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who says exactly what they mean and considers this no special virtue, merely common sense. Consul Das gave her the full briefing. He was thorough because thorough was how he worked, laying out the state of the war, the Keth's hive structure, the casualty figures, the strategic situation, the timeline War Master Dhal had presented. He watched her face as he spoke, the way a careful observer always does, noting the micro-expressions, the adjustments, the signs of a mind taking in information and calibrating its response.
Vask listened to everything without visible reaction. Not the controlled blankness of someone suppressing shock. Something different. Simply listening. Her eyes were attentive and steady throughout. When he finished, she asked a single question. "How long can your ground forces hold the surface line if we clear the orbital pressure?" War Master Dhal, who was present and whose estimation of the Terrans had begun at low and had not yet been given reason to revise significantly, answered in the precise way she answered everything. Statistically, no quantity of additional surface time alters the fundamental calculus. The core problem is one of attrition mathematics that orbital relief does not address. "Give me a number," Vask said. Not rudely, simply directly, in the way of someone who needs information and does not have time for the frame around it. Dhal paused. In 60 years of military service, no one had interrupted her mathematical framing in quite that manner. 60 days, she said, perhaps 70 under optimal conditions. "Good," Vask said. "We start now." The channel closed. Das, Dhal, and Vrex stood in brief collective silence. Then the Terran fleet moved. They did not arrange themselves into clean assault formations that Concordance tactical doctrine prescribed. They broke into fast-moving independent clusters, each one attacking from a different vector, communicating with each other in a manner so rapid and irregular that the Concordance tactical systems could barely follow the pattern. The Keth advance fleet, which had been methodically dismantling the orbital defense grid in the methodical, calculated way the Keth did everything, suddenly had threats arriving simultaneously from 8 directions, adapting in ways the hive's predictive modeling had not been prepared for. The battle that followed was immediate, brutal, and loud in every way that space combat could be loud. The Keth hit the Terran ships with the same overwhelming concentrated firepower that had broken Concordance fleets for 2 years. Terran ships took the hits. They were damaged, some severely, and they kept firing. They kept adjusting. They pushed into the Keth lines through angles the hive's systems had not been designed to defend, and for the first time in months, the Concordance tactical officers watching the engagement saw the Keth forces shift and adjust rather than simply advance. The Keth were reacting. They had not had to react to anything in a very long time. On the surface of Arxon Dhal, exhausted Concordance soldiers crouched in their positions and watched the flashes of weapons fire paint the sky above them. There was more activity up there than they had seen in weeks. A young Dravok soldier, barely past her first military posting, looked up at the light show and asked the older soldier beside her who was fighting up there. Terrans, the older soldier said. She had heard the word before. A young species, primitive by most measures, not taken seriously. "Are they going to help us?" she asked. The older soldier watched a Terran destroyer absorb a direct hit that took out a section of its hull and continue its attack run as if the loss of the hull section was an administrative inconvenience. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "they already are." In the command center, Consul Doss pulled up his research file on Terran history and began reading it again, not looking at the events this time, looking at the patterns underneath them, the things that happened over and over, across every era, through every disaster. He was beginning to understand something that had been there in the text all along, but that he had not previously had the context to see properly. He turned and looked out at the battle in orbit, at those strange and improbable ships that had no business still flying by any engineering standard he knew, and he thought about a word he had encountered frequently in Terran literature, a word that appeared constantly in their history during their worst moments. He had always found it puzzling. A species in genuine crisis, facing genuine annihilation, choosing to use a word that meant nothing practical, a word that described no concrete capability. He was beginning to understand why they used it. The weight of what cannot be measured. The first 10 days were chaos. Not the kind that signals collapse, but the kind that signals the entrance of something genuinely new, something that doesn't know the rules and therefore doesn't follow them, and turns out to be surprisingly difficult to predict because of it. Concordance military doctrine had been built over centuries of accumulated experience into a refined and sophisticated structure. There were protocols for every situation, engagement distances, acceptable loss thresholds, criteria for holding versus withdrawing, frameworks for decision-making at every level of command. These protocols were not bureaucratic constraints, they were wisdom, the distilled result of generations of learning what worked and what got soldiers killed for no gain. They were treated with the respect that wisdom deserves. Terran soldiers behaved as though the protocols were suggestions they had been briefly shown and then misplaced. Concordance tactical observers embedded with Terran units sent back reports that were more bewildered than informative. Terran squads would push into positions that the tactical models clearly identified as not worth the cost we're taking. They would hold ground that the mathematics said should be abandoned, taking casualties to keep terrain that had no obvious strategic value. They would fall back under heavy fire, reorganize in conditions that made reorganization seem impossible, and return to contest the same position from a new angle with no apparent decrease in intensity. It was not clean, it was not elegant, it frequently looked from the outside like controlled disaster, and it worked repeatedly in ways the models had not predicted. War Master Toll spent long hours studying the Terran engagement reports. She was looking for the underlying logical system, the doctrinal principle that was actually guiding decisions beneath the apparent disorder. Every effective military force operated on principles. You simply had to find them. After 6 days, she requested a meeting with Consul Das and admitted, with the particular difficulty of a mind that is rarely wrong about things it cares about, that she had been unable to identify a single unifying principle. Each unit is making independent decisions in real time, not executing a plan, generating one, continuously. It should not produce consistent outcomes at this scale. And yet, she agreed, in a tone that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be. What Toll had identified, without having language for it, was something that Concordance military science had no existing framework to categorize. Terran soldiers did not simply execute tactics, they learned while they fought. Every engagement was simultaneously a lesson. They observed what the enemy did, identified patterns, and began adjusting before the engagement had ended, not because command had issued new directives, but because the soldiers on the ground had noticed something and acted on it individually. A Keth tactic that succeeded in the first hour of a battle would frequently fail in the third, not through any coordinated Terran response, but because enough individual soldiers had recognized it and adapted. The Keth hive was extraordinarily fast, but it was fast at executing a plan, not at building a new one, and the Terrans kept forcing it to build new plans. On the 12th day of the engagement, a Concordance medical officer named Sovelin Dreth was assigned to coordinate with a Terran infantry unit for field liaison purposes. She was Dravak, physically resilient by most standards, with 18 months of frontline experience that she had believed until now made her reasonably difficult to surprise. The first day with the Terran unit adjusted this assessment substantially. She watched a Terran soldier called Corporal Tay Ren take a fragment of shrapnel through the outer muscle of his thigh during a Keth push, crouch behind a collapsed wall section, remove the fragment using a tool from his kit, close the wound with a compression seal from his med pack, stand back up, and resume firing. The entire process occupied 90 seconds. He did not call for medical support. He did not flag himself for line rotation. When Sovelin moved toward him, he pointed her toward another soldier who had taken a hit to the chest and needed her more urgently. She filed a report that evening. In Dravak medical protocol, a wound of that severity triggered mandatory removal from active duty, both for physical treatment and psychological stabilization. The psychological component was considered equally serious. The shock of significant physical trauma was well documented to compromise cognitive function and decision-making in ways that were dangerous in a combat environment. She wrote, "The Terran soldier did not appear to process the wound as an interruption to his function. He appeared to process it as an inconvenience." It was not an isolated incident. Over the following days, she observed it so consistently that it ceased to surprise her and began to unsettle her in a deeper way, the way something unsettling does when you've had time to actually think about what it means. Terran soldiers felt pain. She could confirm this medically, physiologically. There was no question. Their pain response was entirely functional. They simply refused to let it govern them. They felt it, registered it, and continued. It was as if somewhere in the long and difficult history of their species, they had developed the capacity to put pain in a separate chamber of themselves and lock that chamber during a fight. They could not ignore it, they simply would not let it decide for them. What affected Sovelin most, however, was what she witnessed on the 16th night. There had been a difficult engagement that afternoon.
A Terran platoon had held an exposed ridge against a sustained Keth assault for 7 hours and had lost nearly a third of its soldiers in the process. The ridge held. The cost was severe. That evening, Sovalin expected the surviving Terrans to be withdrawn for rest and recovery, standard Concordance protocol following significant loss events, which recognized that grief and trauma required processing time and that soldiers not given that time would perform increasingly poorly. Instead, the soldiers gathered in a sheltered area behind their position and built a small fire. They sat around it. One of them, an older sergeant, began saying names. The names of the people who had not come back from the ridge. She said each name clearly, fully, and after each one she paused, and others filled the pause with small things, a memory, a detail, a single sentence about who that person had been. One soldier wept quietly. Nobody looked away. Nobody pretended not to notice. Another soldier placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, just kept it there. They stayed like that for a long time. Then they slept. In the morning, they were back on the line. Sovalin sat with what she had seen for a long time before she wrote about it. She had seen Concordance soldiers break under less than what this platoon had endured. She had seen experienced warriors require weeks of recovery after losing close companions in combat. These people had grieved genuinely, completely, without suppression, and then risen from it in hours, as if grief were not something that stopped you, but something that needed to move through you before you could move forward. She wrote in her personal notes, "I have observed what I can only call a kind of respect so vast it produces something close to fear. Not fear of them, fear of what it means that such a thing is possible, that a living creature can carry that weight and still stand up." While this was happening in the Concordance ranks, something else was happening in the Keth formation that had, by the testimony of every historian who later studied the records, never happened before in the Keth Dominion's long history of warfare. The hive was struggling. It had not been designed for this. The Keth's supreme military advantage was its predictive modeling, the ability to calculate an enemy's behavior patterns and position forces to exploit those patterns before the enemy understood what was being exploited. Against every species it had faced, this system had functioned almost without exception. Concordance species were disciplined, well-trained, and consistent. Consistency was the key. Consistent behavior produced patterns. Patterns produced predictions. Predictions produced victory. Terran behavior was not consistent, not because they were disorganized. The hive could clearly see they were not disorganized, but because they made individual decisions constantly, and thousands of Terran soldiers making individual decisions simultaneously produced a collective behavior pattern that the hive's modeling systems could not distinguish from random noise. The signal it was trying to isolate was being drowned out by variants the system had not been calibrated to process. A senior Keth biological commander, a rare high-order node responsible for strategic synthesis, issued an instruction that had no precedent in the Dominion's military history. It directed forward forces to specifically target Terran morale, to maximize Terran casualties in sight of other Terran soldiers, to make the cost of continued resistance feel unbearable, to break the will rather than simply the capacity to fight. This strategy had succeeded against every other species the Keth had engaged. The data was extensive and consistent. It did not work on Terrans. Terran soldiers witnessing the deaths of their companions did not become less effective. They became more committed. They held positions more fiercely. They pushed back with greater intensity. The very stimulus the hive had calculated would break them, instead was producing increased resistance in ways the hive's models could not account for. The model said, increase the cost, reduce the resistance. The Terrans said, through their behavior, increase the cost and we will make sure it costs something. The biological commander processed these results for a long time. Then it did something else that had no precedent in its history. It sent a query upward through the hive network. The hive, in its history, did not ask questions. The hive knew things, or it learned things, or it had not yet encountered something. It did not ask. But it asked now.
What are these creatures constructed of? The hive had no answer. There was no answer in the data. There was only data that didn't fit the model, piling up in ways that suggested the model itself was insufficient. In the Concordance Command Center late at night, War Master Toll stood at her display screens and looked at numbers she had been looking at for 2 weeks. Then she looked at them again. The trajectory was still bad. The situation was still desperate. She would not say otherwise, and she would not pretend otherwise, because she did not do those things. But something in the numbers was different from what it had been 3 weeks ago. Small, uneven, too early to call it a trend with the certainty she required before naming anything a trend, but different, changing in a direction that the numbers 3 weeks ago were not changing. She stayed at the screens for a long time, and the expression on her angular face, the expression of a mind that has encountered something it does not yet fully understand, was one that people who knew her had not seen there in a long time. The war was not won, it was not close to won, but it was, for the first time in 26 months, something other than simply lost.
Commander Vask called the meeting at 0300 hours. The Concordance officers who received the summons noted the time with a particular attention because it told them something. Vask was not a person who confused night for day. She was a person who had been working since the previous morning, who had something worth saying, and who said it the moment she had it without waiting for a more conventional hour. They arrived on the bridge of the Unyielding, still straightening their uniforms, and found her already standing at the tactical display, her mechanical hand resting on the edge of the console. Behind her, the display showed the full Keth orbital formation, a dense mass of vessels arranged around a core that the Concordance had known about and discussed and ultimately concluded was unreachable. The Central Command Vessel, the hive's primary relay for this theater of war. Every order, every tactical signal, every coordination instruction that kept the forward Keth fleet operating as a unified force passed through that ship. The Concordance had analyzed approaches to it for months. Every approach ended the same way in the models. Vask pointed to it. That ship is the central relay for all Keth hive communications in this system. Everything the forward fleet does, every adaptation, every coordinated movement, every drone instruction, it runs through there. She paused. If we destroy it, the forward fleet loses coordination. Not permanently, the hive will reroute through secondary channels eventually. But the disruption window, even a few hours of a disorganized Keth fleet, is enough to break their orbital line completely. Without orbital support, their ground forces lose resupply and updated tactical instructions. Your surface forces can push them back and keep pushing. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms are quiet when everyone present is thinking the same calculation and arriving at the same problem. War Master Toll said carefully, "This approach has been modeled before. The command vessel sits at the center of the formation. Fleet density in the surrounding zone makes any direct assault path statistically unsurvivable. No vessel that enters that corridor returns." "Not a fleet," Vask said. The display shifted. A single narrow thread appeared through the Keth formation, not a corridor wide enough for warships, but a precise, winding path between the largest concentrations of enemy vessels, a path that required small craft, fast, low emission, running minimal power signatures. "An insertion team," Vask said. "Small craft, 40 to 50 of them, threading that path under low detection profiles. They reach the outer hull of the command vessel, breach it, fight to the relay core, and destroy it from the inside." She looked around the room. "The survival probability of this mission is very low. I want to be clear about that. I am not offering a plan that everyone comes home from. I am offering a plan that ends this." Fleet Admiral Vrex leaned forward. His voice was not unkind. "You cannot ask soldiers to undertake a mission with those odds." "I did not ask," Vask said. "I described the mission to my people. I told them exactly what it required and exactly what the odds were. I made nothing vague and I softened nothing. She changed the display one final time. A number appeared on the screen. 4,847. No one spoke. That is how many soldiers volunteered after I told them the odds, after I told them that most of them would not return. 4,800 people put their names on that list, and I had to turn the great majority of them away because the insertion craft cannot carry that many. Consul Das looked at the number for a long time. He tried to construct the scene in his mind, a Terran commander standing before her soldiers, laying out a mission from which return was unlikely, and then asking. He tried to imagine the moment when the first hand went up. He could not fully imagine what it required of a person to raise that hand, and he found that the gap between what he could imagine and what apparently happened itself was one of the most important things he had encountered in his 40 years of diplomatic work. War Master Toll said nothing. She was looking at the number, and for once she appeared to have no calculation to offer. The plan was approved before dawn.
The Keth command vessel's defensive screen cycled on a 7-day rotation, with a brief window of reduced sensor coverage that lasted fewer than 40 minutes. That window was the only moment the insertion craft had any realistic possibility of approaching undetected. They had 6 days. A Terran engineer named Priya Sundrakaran had been working for 3 weeks on a device designed to intercept and disrupt hive relay transmissions. She was 23 years old, the youngest member of the Expeditionary Forces Technical Division, and she had joined the mission directly from completing her doctorate. She slept in 4-hour intervals and spent the remaining hours talking to her equipment in the focused, slightly affectionate way of someone who knows exactly what she's asking a piece of hardware to do and respects it enough to ask it properly. She finished the device in 6 days. It was not beautiful. It was held together with precise engineering in some places, and in other places with solutions that a concordance technician who examined it described diplomatically as structurally heterodox. There was a length of wire in the assembly that the technician stated had no formal precedent in military hardware design. The technician wrote a thorough inspection report noting his concerns about the device's unconventional architecture. Then he activated the device in a controlled test environment, and it performed exactly as specified, and he found that his report required significant revision. On the 7th day, the insertion craft launched. 47 vessels, small and dark and cold, running on minimal power, threading out from the Terran fleet's sheltered position and into the space between the lines. 229 soldiers in total. Each one had been briefed on every contingency protocol. Most of those protocols everyone understood were documentation. You do not implement emergency exit procedures if you do not survive long enough for an emergency. The soldiers understood this. They had understood it when they volunteered. Among the 229 was a soldier named Idris Kale. He was 19 years old, from a town so small it appeared on maps as a single dot with no detail attached to the name. He had been in the military for 15 months. He was not the most experienced person on his craft. He was not the fastest or the strongest. He was, by most measurable standards, exactly the kind of soldier who doesn't stand out, who carries his weight, does the work, and doesn't ask for acknowledgement. He had volunteered because, as he explained to the veteran sergeant sitting beside him during the long, silent transit through enemy space, it seemed like the thing to do. The sergeant, who had been fighting for 7 years and heard many reasons for volunteering, looked at him for a moment, and then looked back at the dark outside the viewport. Then she nodded once. There was nothing to add. The insertion went badly from the start. 4 craft were detected and destroyed before reaching the command vessel's outer hull. The remaining craft breached at 9 points simultaneously, and the fighting inside was immediate, close, and brutal in the specific way that fighting in narrow corridors is brutal. No distance, no angles, no tactics that rely on space. Just the next junction and the junction after that, and the defenders who waited at both. They lost soldiers at every turn. The count fell from 229 to 190, then to 140. Then the numbers dropped in the way numbers do when combat is too fast and too close to track carefully. Idris Kale lost the 3 soldiers he had entered the ship with in the first 25 minutes. He kept moving. The relay corps was ahead. That was the mission, and the mission was the reason all of those people had come here, and stopping was not something he was going to do. He reached the relay core chamber with 9 others. By the time they had cleared the chamber's defenders, there were 5 of them remaining, and the remote activation unit for Sundrakaran's device had been hit by weapons fire and had failed. 5 people, no remote trigger, the relay core humming enormously in front of them, vast and loud and central to everything the Keth hive was doing in this system. One of the 5 looked at Idris. He was the youngest person in the room. He had been in the military for 15 months. He looked back at them, and then he looked at the device in his hands, and then he looked at the core. He told the others to leave. His voice was calm. It was the particular calm of someone who has already made a decision and is past the part where doubt is useful. The other 4 looked at each other. There was a moment, brief, full of weight, and then they went. What happened in that chamber in the next 2 minutes was not directly witnessed by anyone who survived to give an account. What was witnessed by every officer on the Concordance command deck, by every soldier on the surface of Arxon Dhal looking up, and by Commander Vask standing on the bridge of the Unyielding with her mechanical hand gripping the console edge, was what happened to the Keth command vessel immediately afterward. It went dark. Not damaged, not reduced, dark, silent, a dead thing in space. And then, like a wave moving outward from the point where a stone enters still water, the Keth fleet went quiet. Ships stopped firing. Drone units drifted without direction. The coordinated, adaptive, perfectly unified machine of the Keth forward fleet became in the space of seconds a collection of disconnected parts that had forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. Because they had. They had literally forgotten, because the mind that told them went out like a light. On the Concordance command bridge, nobody spoke. Then, at the back of the room, a Dravak officer made a low sound, the deep, resonant vocalization her species produced in moments of overwhelming feeling. A Sorathene officer beside her picked it up, then another. Then a Terran near the front produced something entirely different in quality, but identical in meaning. War Master Toll stood at her station and looked at the dark shape of the command vessel on screen. She looked at the drifting, uncoordinated enemy fleet beginning to fragment. She looked at the numbers updating on her display, the probability curves shifting in ways they had not shifted in 2 years. Then the Sorathene War Master, a species that bowed only at the death of someone of genuine greatness, turned towards the empty air in the direction of the command vessel, and she bowed. She held it for a long time. Outside the windows, the Keth fleet began, slowly for the first time in this entire war, to retreat.
The retreat of the Keth was not a rout. Even without their hive coordination, even with their command vessel destroyed and their forward fleet drifting in disconnected pieces, they withdrew in the slow, heavy, methodical way that a tide withdraws. No panic, no chaos, just the steady movement of something that had stopped advancing. But they moved back, and that, after 26 months of watching them move only forward, was everything. The Concordance surface forces pressed forward the moment orbital pressure lifted. Keth ground units, cut off from fleet resupply and receiving no updated tactical instructions from a hive scrambling to reroute through distant secondary channels, fell into rigid and predictable patterns unlike anything they had displayed before. Coalition soldiers fighting alongside Terran units who showed no sign of slowing despite weeks of continuous engagement pushed forward and held and pushed again. By the end of the 3rd day after the command vessel's destruction, the Keth had abandoned Arxon Dhal entirely. The planet was not healed. It would not heal for a long time. The fields were still ash, the towers still broken, the cities still full of smoke, and the particular smell of places that have burned. But the bombardment had stopped. For the first time in over a year, the sky above Arxon Dhal was quiet. People came outside and stood in it. Some of them didn't know what to do with the silence at first. They had lived inside the noise for so long that its absence felt like a pressure suddenly released, something that had been there so long they'd stopped registering it until it was gone. Then they understood, and the sound that replaced the bombardment was very different in nature. Commander Vask did not celebrate. She was not a person who celebrated when there was still work to do, and there was a great deal of work to do. Surviving insertion team soldiers needed to be located and recovered, the dead needed to be properly accounted for, every single one, by name, in the formal records. The fleet needed assessment, supply chains needed re-establishment. She moved through all of it with the same steady, direct efficiency that characterized everything she did, and Consul Das, watching her work, found himself thinking that she was perhaps most herself when the work was hardest and most necessary. The ceremony and reflection that other species moved toward naturally after significant events seemed to fit her less naturally than the labor itself. He approached her on the fourth day, when immediate demands had settled enough for conversation. "The Concordance Council wishes to formally acknowledge what your people have done," he said. "There will be a ceremony. The highest military honor the Concordance can bestow on a commander will be given to you." She looked at him with the direct gaze she gave to everything. "The names of the insertion team," she said, "all of them, read aloud at the ceremony. Every name, in full, not a summary, not a number on a screen." "That is 201 people," Das said. "Yes, it is." He nodded slowly. "It will be done." She went back to her list. The ceremony was held 2 weeks later in the largest space the Concordance's installation could provide. Every senior officer and ambassador of every member species attended. The Terran Expeditionary Force was represented by Vask and a small group of officers who stood quietly in their worn uniforms and looked collectively slightly uncomfortable with the formality, in the way of people who are used to being useful and find the absence of a task to complete disorienting. Consul Das gave the address. He spoke about what the Concordance believed in those dark months before the Terrans arrived, what the best minds they had produced had concluded with all their accumulated knowledge and experience about the nature of the situation. He did not soften it. He said plainly that they believed it was over, that they had looked at the mathematics and found the mathematics unambiguous. He said this not as a confession of failure, but as context, because without understanding how completely finished it had seemed, it was impossible to understand what actually happened. Then the names began. A reader stood at the front of the hall and said each name in full. 201 names, human names from places that most of the species present had never heard of and could not easily pronounce. The hall was perfectly quiet throughout. It took a long time. No one looked away, no one whispered or shifted impatiently. They sat and listened to each name, understanding that each name was a specific person who existed, who made a choice with full knowledge of what it cost, and who was gone. The room gave each name the weight it deserved.
When the last name was read, Vask stood and received the Concordance's highest military honor, a small, plain object that nonetheless carried 400 years of history in its design. She held it in her mechanical hand and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she thanked them simply, briefly, the way she did everything, and sat back down. Back on Earth, there were no grand parades. There were smaller things. Towns held quiet ceremonies in public squares. Schools kept silence. Families lit candles in windows for people who were not coming back. The official responses were thorough. Statements, ceremonies, the formal machinery of governments acknowledging something large. But the deeper response moved through communities differently, the way important things tend to. Not in announcements, but in conversations, in the things people said to each other in ordinary places, in the stories that spread not as grand heroic tales, but as true ones, with all the weight and cost that truth carries. A generation grew up with those stories. They heard about Idris Kale, 19 years old, 15 months of service, from a town most people had never heard of. They heard about Sergeant Orla Fife, who had been fighting for 7 years and had nodded once and said nothing more. They heard about Priya Sundrakarn and the device held together with wire and certainty. They heard about Commander Vask standing on the bridge in the dark, mechanical hand on the console, waiting for light to appear where light was not supposed to be possible. They heard about 4,847 people who raised their hands after being told the odds. They heard about soldiers who grieved at a small fire in the dark and then woke up in the morning and went back to the line. They grew up understanding, in the way that children understand things shown to them rather than explained, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when the moment required it. Not because they were fearless, not because they were built differently or felt less, but because they felt everything and did the thing anyway. Because for them, apparently, that was simply what you did. In the years following the battle, Concordance military academies added a new course of study. Officially, it was titled Terran Combat Psychology and Adaptive Tactical Doctrine. In practice, it was an attempt to understand and formally document something that resisted documentation by its very nature. The course materials expanded with each revision until the primary text exceeded 900 pages, covering pain tolerance, battlefield adaptation, individual decision-making under extreme conditions, and the social rituals Terran soldiers used to process loss and return to function. The concluding statement of that text, written after years of research by a panel of the most respected military scholars the Concordance had produced, was surprisingly brief. It said, "No model sufficiently captures it. It must be witnessed." Consul Doss's own report, completed 8 months after the battle, became required reading at every Concordance War Academy within a decade. He had written it with the precision that 40 years of diplomatic work had given him, careful, measured, thorough, refusing to overstate. It covered tactics and biology and culture and the specific quality of Terran military decision-making that the Keth hive had found impossible to model. The line quoted most often, the one that eventually appeared carved into the stone of the Academy's main entrance in the original language Doss had used, came near the end of the report. Terrans do not fight because they believe they will succeed. They fight because they cannot accept the alternative to trying. This distinction is, I now understand, the most dangerous force in the known galaxy. War Master Toll retired from Concordance service 4 years after the battle. Her retirement address, unusual for a Sorthene who typically departed positions without ceremony, spoke at length about what the war had changed in her understanding of what was and was not predictable. She said that she had spent her entire career trusting mathematics as the highest available authority on reality, and that she still trusts mathematics. But she had learned, she said, that there existed variables that did not appear in any equations she had ever written, things that could not be measured in advance and therefore could not be incorporated into predictions. She did not name these things. She said only that she had watched them operate and that she would not repeat the error of excluding them from her calculations. In a university classroom on a world that had once been a battlefield, many decades after the war, a young Keth scholar sat with a text on her desk and a question she couldn't resolve. She had read every analysis of the Battle of Arxon Dhal. She had studied the tactical records, the engineering reports, the casualty data, the hive's own internal assessments. But one thing none of the analyses quite reached. After class, she brought the question to her professor, an old academic who had spent his career studying the war from every angle and had, over the years, been asked versions of this question more times than he could count. "What is the Terran word," she asked, "for the thing the hive couldn't model? The variable War Master Toll said couldn't be measured, the thing underneath all of it. What did the humans call it?" Her professor was quiet for a while. He had given different answers to this question at different times, depending on who was asking, and he was thinking about which answer was true. He thought about a 19-year-old from a small coastal town standing alone in a chamber at the center of a Keth worship, looking at a device in his hands. He thought about 4,847 raised hands. He thought about a small fire and the names of the dead and soldiers who slept and woke and returned to the line. He thought about what holds a person together when every calculation says there is no reason to continue. "They have always had many words for it," he said. "They are a species that has spent its entire history developing vocabulary for the things that keep them going rather than the things that stop them." He looked out the window at the sky above the campus. Ordinary sky, peaceful, full of ordinary light. "But the one they reach for most often," he said, "is simple." He looked at her. "Hope," he said. She wrote it down. She looked at it for a moment. One word, small on the page, seemingly insufficient for what it was being asked to carry. Then she looked up at the sky the way her professor was looking at it, at the quiet, unremarkable, ordinary sky above a world that had once been a battlefield and was now simply a place where people lived. Outside, the day was going on without thinking about the cost of itself. People were walking to places they needed to be. Children were in the streets. Somewhere, a door opened, and someone came through it carrying something, on their way to do something ordinary, with no thought at all for the fact that the sky above them was the color it was because of what certain people had decided to do in the dark. That, perhaps, was the whole point. That was what had been fought for. Not monuments, not recognition, not the galaxy knowing the name of every person who had held that line. Just this, ordinary days, going on. People walking through doors, children in streets, a sky that was only sky. The price of it was in the records, in the names read aloud in a quiet hall, in a professor's long pause before answering a student's question. The cost was real, and it was enormous, and it was not forgotten by the people who carried it. But the thing it had purchased, the ordinary, unremarkable, priceless thing, was happening right outside the window, all around them, exactly as it was supposed to.